Okay, welcome, Chandrima. Great to see you here. Before we get into the big ideas, can you tell our listeners who you are and what drives you? Not the CV version of you, but the real you. We'd love to know more.
Totally. Thank you so much, Jenny and Leah, for having me here. Hi, everyone. My name is Chandrima. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a physicist turned responsible AI practitioner slash leader, and now an EdTech social enterprise founder. My career essentially started in academia. So I was a theoretical physicist. I don't know if I should say was because I think I still am. You never stop being one. And I worked in a variety of academic institutions around the world. Did my PhD from Cambridge, moved on to Dartmouth and then Harvard, and returned back to Cambridge. And it was all going really, really well until I essentially had a good hard look at myself and my career during COVID, and realized that essentially it's probably not fair given all the privileges and opportunities I've had in my life to spend all my time researching something that is really specific and really niche and really interesting, still is, but ultimately has limited impact on society at large. And that spurred me to move more into community organizing, particularly around gender justice, around COVID. And at the time, during COVID, I was in the UK, so there was a particularly horrific situation where it was very difficult to get asylum for people who were fleeing domestic violence. And I was working specifically around that. And while I was working there, so something that you should probably know about me is I love a chat. I'm Bengali, so it is actually institutionalized in our culture. It's called an adda. So an adda is a chat that is long ranging. So you can talk about anything from philosophy, politics to what you cooked for lunch yesterday or this annoying stone that's stuck in your shoe. So I love a chat. And then because I love chatting and I love meeting people, I've always been involved in community organizing in one way or another. And during that journey, I realized that all the people I was meeting, more or less, were not scientists or technologists. In fact, whenever I told people that I'm a scientist, they were like, "Oh, you don't actually look like a scientist, or you don't feel like a scientist." And this made me think that, first of all, that can't be true. There's got to be more scientists and technologists who are interested in communities. And second of all, it's actually a really big problem that more people are not involved in science and technology. And my journey towards from being a scientist in a very ivory tower institution down then to become a technologist made me think that I really just want to do something around science and technology and use what I know, and also use my kind of, I guess, my propensity for a chat and reaching out to people to create solutions that make sense for more of us instead of just a few. And that is what propelled me to move from academia into responsible AI, where I wanted to create technologies that actually had positive social impact, to now to try to create a social enterprise around education and using technology in education in a way that involves the community from the start to the finish and actually empowers them to become educators of the future.
Wow, wow. I'm going to do a very light-hearted thing before I hand over to Leah, because I know Leah will be desperate to talk to you because there's so much connection between what you said. But did you say a chat is in Bengali is Ada? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I guess in English it would be ADDA.
Okay, Ada,
Yeah.
because basically this is the name of your podcast. So if you decide to do one, Ada with Chandrima,
Yes,
I hear it. It's got a beautiful ring to it.
I
And
love it.
yeah, as soon as you said it, I was like, oh gosh, I see it now. So if that happens, yeah, again, I need some credit. I need some credit if it happens.
You
The
are
name came
fully
from
going to be credited for it. Yes, 100%.
yeah, but I know Leah wants to become what you said because there's huge connections between the two of you.
Yeah, yeah, there really are. And I've had someone say to me before, "Wow, you don't look like that's what you do. You don't look like you'd be working in tech." And it also kind of frames it as, what do these people look like as well? What do you think that they look like? It's almost like there's a certain box that people should fit in if that's what they want to do. But I think it's really, really amazing what you're doing. I love it. I really do see some similarities, even if it's just like slight mirrors in your community outreach. I can just tell from the way you're speaking about it that it's your passion. What was the moment that you realized that your skills were actually what this problem needed? Because I think that a lot of people know what they want to do and they know how to do it, but they can't see it in themselves a lot of the time.
I mean, this was actually a conversation that I was having with a friend of mine who was an academic. She's also kind of left the establishment. She was working as an archaeologist essentially, and her passion was like knitting and sewing. And so there was like she would do a lot of like advocacy for queer people in like sort of what she calls the thread community. And I remember having this conversation with her. I was in the UK, she was in the US, and we were having a Zoom call during COVID. And we were both saying that it's kind of horrific what's going on in the world. And at the time, I was particularly upset because I was stuck in the UK essentially, and my whole family is in India, and I couldn't come and see them. And I just lost my grandfather, and I couldn't come to see him, and so on. So I was in a really bad headspace, and also like every day there were the death tolls, right? The numbers that kept coming out. And she was sort of talking to me about the fact that, like, isn't it weird that, like, we've been to all of these institutions that everybody really wants to get into and it's supposed to be super prestigious. And technically, whenever you go to these institutions, you get told, oh, you're the smartest of everyone there is. Like, you know, you're like the top whatever percentage of the world. And yet, we're sitting here when the world is literally burning, doing this very specific thing that no one will read. Or even if people read it, there will be a very specific group of people who have received similar training, who have been in these institutions as well, who will read it. And it's just, and she was quite upset as well. And she was like, it's a crime. And she was like quite fired up and so on. But I remember sitting in that conversation and thinking that, well, I've always wanted to be an academic. I've always wanted to teach people. But who do I actually get to teach? I get to teach, at the time I was in Cambridge, so I got to teach people who gone to Cambridge and could pay the fees, really. So I think that was the moment where I was like, that doesn't sound right.
I had a similar thing, I think, where I was just like, I'm doing this job that I have got that not many people are doing, and I've graduated from university, and I could continue on the path I'm on, or I could make change. And I was speaking to someone a few months ago, and they described that jump into doing working for yourself, but also working for something community minded and social as almost like when you are running into like a dead end and you're reaching your point um where it's like you can't do much more in the job that you're in, so you have to turn around and find another path to create change. And I definitely reached that dead end, and from the sound of it, so did you. Yeah.
Yeah, I
No,
think it's a
100%. Sorry, Jenny,
no,
go
no,
for it.
yeah. I just think it's really interesting that you know, you're both, Leah's work is looking at crime, but also particularly gender-based crime, and you are thinking about violence against women. Tell us a bit more specifically around about DARS.
Yeah, so DARS is an AI education platform that seeks to bring access to primary education to the most marginalized learners, specifically marginalized learners in the global south. And currently, we're operating out of West Bengal, India, and we're looking at rural and semi-rural populations. So DARS essentially is supposed to bring affordable education, which is not accessible to groups of learners because simply there are not enough government schools More government schools are being shut every day. And for the government schools that there's a real dearth of teachers. Now, I understand that obviously the best intervention here would be sweeping policy change, which would provide more funding to schools and would employ more teachers. I have actually been in conversations in the UK around the feasibility of using AI teaching assistants. And it has generally been seen as a bit of a negative because you don't want to replace the labor of teachers. I completely agree with that outlook, but the situation that I'm dealing with in around West Bengal is very different. Simply put, there are no teachers to replace. And in the absence of these policy changes that would provide more teachers, there are generations of students who are being left without access to basic numeracy and literacy skills. So that's where DARS comes in. It comes in as an AI-assisted tutoring platform, and our commitment is to provide access to this platform. People can use it at 10 cents per student per month. We are also committed to making sure, and we have built it accordingly, that it works with the infrastructure constraints of the region. So I don't know if this is kind of common knowledge, but the adoption of basic smartphones in India is around 80% across rural as well as urban populations.
Mm.
So people have access to a basic smartphone. They have access to 3G and 4G connections. Now, most other AI tutoring platforms that exist cannot work on just a 3G, 4G connection and requires a stable internet connection. So we had these constraints in mind when we built DARS. So we wanted to make sure that whatever educational content we were providing could be accessed in a short form way and that could work on these Android phones in 3G, 4G connections. So we're using a hook into an app called Telegram, which is actually used quite widely across the Indian subcontinent. But in DARS, we don't think the technology is the main focus of the product. I always say that the product is not this Telegram app that we've built. I always say that the main product is the community model. And that's central to our vision for DARS. Because at DARS, we don't believe that there is a real difference between learners and teachers. I think all of us can be learners and teachers, and the difference just occurs because of circumstance. And in fact, we actually think that the best learning happens when we teach. And that's why our motto is learn to teach and teach to learn. So the way the community model works is that when you are a user and you're using DARS, you are not only incentivized to finish topics and move forward in your individual learning journey, you're incentivized more when you reach a certain point of completion in your topics to pair up with a fellow learner. And we call these people peer mentors. So the idea is that you will be using peer-to-peer mentoring and you will be incentivized with even greater completion points when you're actually able to help somebody else get to where you're getting. In cases where a classroom structure exists, when there is a classroom that students are going to, or when we are able to organize out-of-school youth into a classroom-like structure, then there are more points given to the overall completion of topics for the collective, for the classroom. So in this way, we are trying to not just create access to primary education, we're trying to actually create community relationships. And we're trying to enthuse people who are learners, to become teachers themselves at a later point. And we are trying to inspire them to become teachers for their own communities.
Wonderful. This is what this is all about. This is what AI for equity is all about. People think it's taking away, but what it's doing in this situation is leveling the playing field. People who would not have got education now will have access to it. And that number, you said 10 cents, is really important. I visited India recently and I was advised that the typical salary for someone who's not living in poverty is equivalent to £4,000 English pounds a year. And so understanding that it needs to be affordable, things that we think £15 a month subscription or whatever we think, that's a lot of money, particularly in some parts of India. And in India, broadly because of the rupee to the pound. So making it affordable, making it accessible is really key. And actually, people who would never have got this are now able to get it. That is the key. But also underlying it, we're really hearing about all of the academic knowledge you have about learning, about helping people is all coming into play here, because it's a very clear theory of learner stroke, that we're all learners. Ultimately, we can all be learners and teachers. The peer mentor aspect and also the community aspect. And something that I always say to people, I do a lot, I talk a lot about imposter syndrome. And I say one of the best ways to overcome imposter syndrome is to mentor other people, because then you realize how much you know. And it's, very much aligned with what you're saying here. If I peer mentor someone, I start to realize I've got something to offer you. I have some knowledge myself, and you do the same. And then we exchange knowledge. So it's a really lovely model that I'm hearing underpinning all of this. And I love the point that AI is the tool. It is not it's not the solution to everything. It's the tool that is enabling this. And yeah, very much aligned with how we think about this idea of AI for equity. So thank you so much for creating it and looking beyond yourself to think, how can I support those people who might not have what they need?
Mm-hmm. I would just like to say that what you've said reminded me about this year's International Women's Day theme, Give to Gain, as well. It ties in almost perfectly. You have to give knowledge to gain knowledge, and to share is to care as well. That's something that someone said to me on International Women's Day this year. I think the sharing of knowledge, and what you said, like everyone can be a teacher, everyone can be a student, is so applicable, especially when you're dealing with violence against women and girls, and especially within communities as well.
Yeah, and you know what? So I teach in a community school myself, pro bono, and most of my students are actually femme people. Like, not all of them are children, they are various age groups. And I don't think people really appreciate, when talking about these figures around inequity in education, how much harder it is for people who are coded as femme to actually reach to the place where the lessons are happening. So, like, for me personally, on a weekly basis, I do deal with instances of violence against, like, my students, which prevent them from coming, or which prevent them to meaningfully engage in the lesson. But what I've noticed is that what keeps them coming through everything is not just the lesson. I teach maths. Like, I'm not kidding myself that they are, you know, completely fascinated with laws of indices. I think it's the relationships that we have, that I have with the students, that they have with each other. And that's why we built this model to be as
Yes.
relational as possible. Because when things get hard, what keeps you going are the relationships.
100%. Like, there's nothing stronger than a community that can come together. I was actually having a conversation about that last night, and I was going around a group of people and saying, what does a better Britain look like? And quite a lot of people said synonyms of just the word connected. I think there's a huge global want for community, and it just sounds like you're really building that. Um, yeah, it's great.
I think we should pivot to talk a little bit more about responsible AI. Did you have some thoughts about that, Leah? Some
I did. When I was doing my research on you, I saw that you worked on the technical side and policy side. You consulted with the EU and UK, and you've also built algorithms to detect bias. Most people, I would say, live in either one of these worlds, and I was wondering what do you think people misunderstand about each other that stops them being able to connect?
Yeah, and I was thinking about this a lot throughout my career, because obviously I entered the field as a technologist, and I had some preconceived notions about policymakers and regulators. Um, Fun fact, like, when I entered into sort of the policy side of things, I had this method, right? Because I was obviously an academic in, maths and computer science, that I would skim large pieces of text or a document looking for the equation or the code snippet, and then that would help me understand the whole thing. And guess what? When you're looking at large policy documents, there's no code snippet or equation that you could look at. So I found that very daunting when I first started. But that aside, I think the biggest complaint that I hear from technologists about policy is that, oh, it's anti-innovation. It's more paperwork. It's more checkbox. It's more exercises that prevent us from moving forward and building really, really cool stuff. And I think that what a lot of technologists don't understand, and I myself wouldn't have understood unless before I did this work, was that policy can actually be a really great enabler. What it needs to be is that it needs to have objective metrics as well as a framework for implementing as well as monitoring it. And that needs to be communicated really well to all the technologists and other stakeholders who are involved. And I actually have a first-hand experience of this working when I was in the responsible AI team at Lloyd's. Obviously, much smaller scale, so easier said than done. But having a framework that communicated the AI assurance policy and building it with all the people who would need to follow it instead of just like slapping it on their heads at, suddenly out of the blue, that made the world of difference around how people saw those policies as well. And that's kind of why I also wanted to build the tooling, because when I say that there needs to be objective metrics and everyone can understand, we also need to have tooling that is easy to use, that can actually produce those metrics that everyone can understand and then produce to show adherence to set policies. Now, from the other end, from policymakers, it's really interesting, but policymakers, I think, a lot of the times overestimate how much power, how much decision-making power, rather, technologists actually have in deploying a product, and particularly in the selection of the use case in which the product is deployed. So, all of the horror stories that you hear about AI deployments gone wrong or it being used in discriminatory ways or being used, in worst case scenarios in war, I'm pretty confident, in some cases have first-hand knowledge of the technical teams and the tech leads on those projects either not being told about what those deployments were going to do, not being given, or if they were told, they were not given a choice to influence how those deployments would happen, or in one case, I definitely can say, actively went out and said that this is wrong, this should not be used like this, and was completely overridden, sidelined, or in one case fired. So I think that there's a misunderstanding of how, and this is just a wider conversation, right? Of the people who build things, how much ownership do they have on how the thing that they build gets used?
That's such a scary thought, isn't it, really? I actually think that is maybe the purpose of everything we're doing, that we're trying to make sure that, these tools are used in a way that serve everyone. And I think what happens typically is people see a great idea and think, how can I make money out of that? And how can I keep it for myself and not share it with anyone else so I can have more power? And the tool then is not deployed in the way that was expected, or in a way that's thoughtful or ethical. And that's a challenge, isn't it? Because as someone who's an innovator, you probably just want to come up with great ideas, but you can't foresee, what people will do with it. And sometimes it's positive. I think the Post-it note was created because someone was asked to create glue, and then that glue ended up being peelable, and then they realized, I could use it on Post-it notes and we can stick them and we can take them off. So sometimes it's a good thing, but sometimes it's not used in the way that we want it to be. You've talked a lot about the right people not being in the room. Just now you were telling us sometimes people are advocating for an idea to be used in a certain way or not, or a tool, but sometimes we just don't have the right people in the room, full stop. Why do you think that's so hard to fix, even in organizations that know better? Even in potentially responsible AI teams, or in, government offices where it should be about the good of all. Why don't we have the right people in the room where decisions are being made?
So, again, something that I've kind of grappled with over my career. And I think for me right now, if you ask me today, I think the answer is organizational structure. Now, I know that we're all like used to a restructure, which means X people will be laid off and a consultant firm will be hired, etc. But the truth is that the way organizations are structured in typically quite hierarchical ways, they are structured so that most people who work in the organization, if not all, have very little ownership over their outcomes. Now, if they don't have ownership over their outcomes, of course, I think it leads to worse outcomes, but also they don't have this emotional relationship with said outcomes, right? So if I don't feel like I can influence the work that I do 8 hours a day, and I may be the most responsible, most community minded person outside of my, my 9 to 5, but there is a sense of pessimism that will obviously start to creep in about how much I can actually bring those values into my day job, essentially. Then, for those of us who are actually interested in bringing that into our day jobs and have been trying to do so, there's also the structure of, I would say short-termism. So the metrics on which people are assessed and they have to adhere to if they want to keep their jobs, progress, what have you, are quite short term and quite, like specific type driven. Like there are KPIs which may or may not be linked to the actual productivity of the product, let alone the social impact of the product. So, in a way, the way the organizations are structured are not only anti social impact, but in a way, they're also a little bit anti innovation. Like, no one is incentivized to innovate with the best possible product, rather to hit these very specific KPIs and goals. I also want to say that there is actually a very interesting thing that I see happening with organizations who deploy technology. They create a very specific, clear binary between staff and users. So users is everybody else, and staff are the people who are hired in the organization. And so it's very difficult to have this dialogue with having the people who are most affected or on whom the technology will essentially be deployed from this outset because of the way things are structured. Like you can't have users in the room. Maybe you can have one or two focus groups, but having everyday users from start to finish, from ideation to shipping, that's almost impossible with the way things are set up. And I'll also say that I have, again, because I have built some products internally for internal use, where the users were actually employees of the same organization, I have seen the difference it makes to have users involved from the very beginning, from the ideation, and actually influencing how the product progresses and how useful the product actually is at the end of it when users have been involved from the get-go.
Yeah, that's so, what you said is so interesting. It's almost like people parking certain parts of their experience and knowledge at the door when they go into an organization because they know it won't be utilized, and who knows who it will affect, and the difference between actually it affects me. And so I actually really care about this. And so I'm going to make sure my voice is heard. As you said it, I felt it, actually viscerally thinking about that. If it affects me, I'm going to care. There's actually something going on. I don't know if you've seen it recently on social media. It says 750 people, I think or 750,000 people in London have lost their homes. And then it says, if you replace London with another country, will you care as much? And it's that, isn't it? If it's about us, it really matters and we're invested. When it's about someone else or we're not sure what the outcome will be, we don't care, and we've got to create the care in it. So yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think we can all resonate with it.
Yeah, I also think that sometimes maybe AI is built with the wrong question in mind. It's people say, how do we make this safe rather than should we build this at all? You know?
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Totally. And the answer of should we build this at all? If you're asking people who won't be affected by it, if we shouldn't have built it after all, they'll say, yeah, sure. I mean, it's going to make us a lot of money. Why not? Sounds great. But
Yeah.
if you then have user groups who are involved from the beginning, um, then there's a market difference, not just in building the product, but even how data is collected. And this is an example that I was thinking about because I'm sure you've heard about the Amazon Recognize algorithm, which had very like quite significant racial bias in its accuracy and was deployed upon around the west coast of the US, mostly to surveil and incarcerate black and brown people. As a reaction to this, there was a database that was created by various black and brown community groups in the US called Data for Black Lives. And this was mapping how disproportionately the pandemic affected black and brown communities. And even that, right? So when there is a database of faces that has been collected and it's not in your control, the question will always be why are you taking pictures of people's faces and storing them? Whereas in this case, which was actually created by the communities affected, they were collecting data on how a pandemic was disproportionately affecting people. So even the intention behind which data sets are collected changes when you get communities involved.
It does. And I think it just shows the importance of community and of kindness as well. A lot of these big corporations aren't coming with new AI models, new tools with kindness. They're coming at it with the idea to streamline things and streamline people and put people into boxes, but they're still somehow missing the mark.
And I don't, I always like write about this as well. This exact point that you made that it's not coming, that these models are not being built with kindness in mind or the use to people in mind, actually affects so many decisions around how the model is built. So in the case of like large language models or Gen AI models, scientifically speaking, if we throw out every other consideration of responsibility and social impact out the door, scientifically speaking, smaller models that are trained for very specific tasks far outperform large models completely just out of the box, right? They are cheaper to train, they're cheaper to build, they're cheaper to maintain, and they don't create such a huge sort of constraint or such a huge draw on resources. But because it's not the efficiency of the product and it's not really the usability of the product that is in mind when people are building these models or the decisions are being made, or there's not kindness in your minds, you're actually building a scientifically less usable, like a worse product. And I always say that this is not just a question of morality, it is a question of optimization, if you want to speak in those terms. It's a question of scientific rigor. It's a question of making sure that what you're doing is actually good and usable.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I guess that, there's so much in here about also trust. Right now, I think there is a lack of trust around people's use of AI. I know some supermarkets now have facial recognition as you walk in, and there've been some cases where people have been, barred from a supermarket because they've got the facial recognition incorrect. And that's just the start, really, of where this can take us. And so I think that, whether we're thinking societally or whether we're thinking about organizations, there is a sense that sometimes people are wondering how much of what is being done through AI and our engagement with AI is around transformation, and how much of this is a kind of performative way of tracking, tracing, etc. And I wonder about that from your experience, that idea of asking us to participate in AI. Is it in our best interest? Is it generally transformative and going to change the world and the world of work and our lives for the better? Or how much you think that perhaps there is a performative action around it right now?
So I'm an optimist in most situations, I think. So I'm going to say yes, AI is transformative. what isn't transformative or useful or helpful for us is the ownership model. The ownership model is broken of technology. And if we can fix this ownership model and make sure that it is a resource that can be built, administered, owned by more of us, by communities, more democratically, in a more inclusive way, then yes, it is 100% going to be transformative. But that is not really the case right now. And I see several blockers to this. Of course, the ownership model itself has to be fixed, and all of the structures that we discuss need to be fixed. But there's a big blocker to this in terms of awareness and education. It's precisely because of the point that you just made, Jenny, that people don't trust AI. I find that a lot of people don't want to engage with it. And just as a side note, I've started trying to consult with community organizations, NGOs around AI. And a lot of the sort of the reactions I immediately get is that, oh, AI is evil. I don't really want to engage with it. And that's so dangerous though, because if there is no one there who actually understands the technology to create effective resistance and to correct those community models, then we're not going to be able to create a future in which AI is transformative. And we won't be able to actually use the transformative power that it can bring us. And so I go back to the whole point always around education, that unless we can democratize access to education and have a large mass of people who are aware, who are educated, who are engaged, who know what the ins and outs of the technology are, if not necessarily build it themselves, but understand it enough to understand the limitations and the trade offs of it, only then can we effectively start to create a sustainable future using the benefits of AI.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just gonna clap. I'm agreeing. I'm really agreeing. Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's something you talk about a lot, Leah, don't you?
it
This
is.
idea of actually, if our voice isn't in the room, if we're not at the table making, implementing and influencing, then we're going to be left behind. So,
We are.
yeah, yeah. And
I
I
think, yeah.
carry on.
I think in terms of AI, we're almost being. I understand why people say AI is bad, AI is evil. This is like a conversation that I have probably a good few times a week, and the the more AI models are built, the more examples I have of amazingly built and human-led AI models. But I'm also confronted with the fact that, oh, there are AI models out there that aren't doing things that are good. And oh, maybe there weren't women or people of color or queer people or you know, non-able-bodied people in these rooms when these models were created. And I think that having just that diversity at those tables in those rooms would massively change the way that people not in this space view AI as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do,
Sorry, Jenny, go for it.
No, no, I just think, yeah, I know, Leah, you're so interested in the bigger picture.
Yeah.
And yeah, I wondered if you, yeah, wanted to move us into that space.
Yeah, yesterday, as I said, I was asking what does a better Britain look like? And it really made me wonder, especially I was asked quite a few times, what does it look like in reality when organizations and policymakers use AI for good and use it for specific problems, not just abstract ideas? For me, it was having a more connected society, having a more optimistic future, things like that. But what does it look like for you?
When you use AI for good, or what does
When
a better Britain look like?
organizations and policymakers would actually use AI for good and not just for abstract ideas and values, but for specific problems.
So, for me, when organizations are using AI to solve problems that exist for the people who are the most affected by those problems, that is an example of using AI for good. So, an example of using AI not for good is trying to use AI to reduce your workforce. I mean, the larger societal ramifications of that are quite bad. But if you use AI, for example, to optimize trade routes to allow cheaper delivery of food to areas that need it, that is a really great example of using AI in a way that we couldn't have, used technology before. Using AI, I'll obviously say using AI for education is a good way to use it in this context. But I also want to caveat this with the fact that there is no absolute usage of AI for good, because it will very much depend upon the context in which we're using it. So the brief sort of roadmap that I usually give people when they say, how should I use AI ethically in my organization? I always say that start out with an ideation of what are the biggest problems that your organization is facing. Once you've listed those problems out, ask yourself, is there a manual solution that I can access? As in, there will always be a manual solution, but maybe I can't pay for it, or there aren't enough resources available, or there aren't enough trained people available. There could be a number of constraints. So ask yourself if there is a manual solution that is available to you to solve that problem. If the answer is no, then ask yourself, can this problem be solved by something that is repeatable? If it is repeatable, then you don't need AI. You can write a deterministic piece of code and you can solve your problem, and that'll be a lot safer. If the answer is no, and you absolutely do need to have a solution that is not repeatable and must be automated for you to solve that problem, I will say always create a time span. A time span after which you will re-evaluate if the AI solution is working. You will create metrics that will tell you what you want to achieve with this AI solution. And if at the end of it, you still think that this AI solution is working, then transition into a technical resource that is community owned, that is small, that is local, and that can be administered by the group that you're looking to, influence or impact positively. So obviously, when you're doing this journey of using proprietary AI, for example, to solve your problem, there is a large section of that journey which must include skilling, upskilling, education, so that when you get to the end of that off-ramp period, when you get to that end of that period, you actually have people within your organization who are enabled and empowered to build that community solution that works specifically for that problem. So, yeah.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. So we're coming closer to the close of our conversation, and we could definitely talk all day. And many of the things you said, I'd love to dig into a little bit more, to be honest with you. But maybe that's going to be a part 2. But I'm thinking about our listeners, really. And we have such a wide-ranging listenership from globally, which is really wonderful, and from all walks of life. But if there was a young South Asian woman, maybe the same age as you were when you started your PhD, and they're watching and wondering whether they have a role in shaping how AI develops, and actually they don't have to be a woman, just a young South Asian person, what would you want them to know?
I would want them to know that everybody has a role in shaping a sustainable socio-technical future. I would want them to understand that they may not have all of the resources, all of the opportunities on their side, but whatever they have, the most important thing that they can do with that is to open doors and create opportunities for others, similarly fortunate as them, and most importantly, less fortunate than them. And I want them to also know that it is imperative that they do this if they want to move forward in a future where they feel free. Because I don't think that you can be free alone unless we're all able to move towards something that resembles freedom together. None of us are going to be free.
Now we're just going to go on to the quick fire round. I'm going to throw 3 quick questions at you. First instinct answers. I love this. I love doing this. I just love what people come out with. I feel like you always get really, really interesting snippets here. So, AI in education, transformative tool or dangerous shortcut?
Transformative tool.
Nice. The one thing the AI industry needs to hear about but refuses to?
You have to include users or you will never build good products.
Amazing. And in 10 years, what does success actually look like for DARS?
10 years, DARS will be used by communities to learn everything, not just primary education, but how to keep each other safe across the world.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much.
We're looking forward to that bright future. It's been
Yeah,
wonderful to speak with you.
100%. We're
we're
on it.
manifesting it.